Friend, enemy, or frenemy? How do Indians view the rise of China and its implications for India's rise? Join the conversation on this important topic by taking the China Challenge survey. The survey has been put together by researchers at the Takshashila Institution. Answer our 10 simple questions and let your voice be heard in shaping India's policy towards China. For more details, log on to www.takshashila.org.in or you can click on the link and take the survey in the show notes. Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm your host, Rakshith, a research analyst at Takshashila Institution. And today I have Tenzing Dhamdul with me. And he's a Tibetan refugee and a research associate at the Foundation for Non-Violent Alternatives, a not-for-profit and public policy organization that undertakes the objective study of Tibetan affairs and the related security implications for India. And in this episode, our primary focus is to understand the process of reincarnation of Dalai Lama and the geopolitics around it, especially the Chinese interference. Thank you so much, Tenzing Dhamdul, for joining us today.
Thank you, Rakshith. And I've been following Takshishila's podcast, All Things Policy. So it's a privilege to be here, and being a Tibetan, I'll try to share my thoughts and clear some doubts which all of you have on this very sensitive and much talked about topic these days,
Right.
about the succession.
Right. That's great to hear, and it's really our pleasure to have you on All Things Policy. Even before jumping into this really sensitive issue, would you please explain us how Tibetan Buddhism is different from other branches of Buddhism like Mahayana, Hinayana, or Vajrayana? What exactly makes Tibetan Buddhism different?
Firstly, Rakshit, I would like to bring to the table that I'm not a monk and a so-called expert on this subject, but being a Tibetan, born up in a Buddhist family,
Mhm.
someone who follows His Holiness, the other
Mhm.
lamas for that matter. I've been across and read books, been taught about Buddhism by Tibetan lamas, so I have my say on this. So basically, Tibetan Buddhism more or less falls along the lines of Mahayana. Like basic Buddhism can be differentiated to two bodies, like Hinayana and Mahayana,
Hmm.
like lesser vehicle and greater vehicle. People don't like to categorize it that way because both has its own perks and deficiencies. But what differs between the two is like the Mahayana form of Buddhism, which is the Tibetan tradition of Buddhism,
Mhm.
follows a path of Buddhism which is beyond your samsaric cycle. It goes beyond that. Like you attain enlightenment, and that's not the end of the journey. Your journey ends when you find enlightenment from everyone. So that is how Hinayana and Mahayana is different. Mahayana goes for an enlightenment for everybody. In Hinayana form of Buddhism, the ultimate goal is for oneself, an individual, to get enlightenment, and your journey ends there. But
Right.
in Mahayana form of Buddhism, that is not there. And you also mentioned the Vajrayana form of Buddhism. This is a form of Buddhism where the Mahayana form of Buddhism went into Tibet, and it sort of molded itself and sort of transformed. I think transform would be not the right word, but like fused itself with the old Tibetan forms of religion practice there, including the Pön religion, and we find this fusion of sort of Buddhism called the Vajrayana Buddhism. So
Mhm.
both of these are very much relevant when it comes to the Tibetan tradition of Buddhism.
Right. With that, I'll directly ask the really important questions that I wanted to ask you for a long time. Firstly, can you please walk us through the traditional process of how do we go through the entire process of identifying and selecting the Dalai Lama, and how does the reincarnation process look, and the role of Tibetan monks and the elder lamas in this process, basically. So, a brief idea maybe on the entire reincarnation process.
Sure, actually. So firstly, one has to understand when this reincarnation sort of process began, because
Mhm.
when Tibetan Buddhism came into Tibet from India, like when we see Buddhism in India, there was not a lot on reincarnation. Otherwise, we would have a reincarnation of Buddha himself. So that
Right.
was not there. So the concept of reincarnation, in many ways, is a form of succession where the lineage of that particular Lama, that particular Buddhist master could be continued and his legacy could be carried forward. So, as I mentioned before, because the aim of Mahayana Buddhism or the Tibetan tradition of Buddhism is for having all the sentient beings enlightened. So,
Mhm.
one way is to have your legacy continued. So, initially, there were these, I mean, in Tibetan Buddhism, we have a lot of different sects, and one of the prominent sects, which is still relevant and continues to play a significant role and is one of the lineages of Tibetan Buddhism, the Sakya sect. Like they were one of the first Buddhist rulers of entire Tibet. Like, and they had this unique form of succession, which was different from what we have with the Dalai Lamas and other lamas and other tugus for that matter. That is predominantly used. It is the lineage because the Sakya Lamas had this unique rule where they could marry, and so their bloodline, you have these. It's like a passing of succession through your own familial structure. But
Mhm.
we find other sects, especially the Kakyu sect, which was also very relevant during that period. All this is happening around the 13th and 14th century.
Mhm.
So we had the Kakyu sect, and this was the very sect where the first form of reincarnation, which all of us know, and which is very much popular and practiced by every sect these days,
Okay.
where we have a lama. A
Mhm.
lama basically is a celibate person, so they cannot bear child.
Mhm.
So their lineage should be passed. So in here we have a particular form of tradition, which was also eventually followed by the Gelugpa sect, which is
Mhm.
where Dalai Lamas are currently part of.
Mhm.
So this is a basic idea of how reincarnation came into Tibet, and so
Mhm.
going to your question of how does one identify the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama?
Mhm.
Basically, there are a lot of different processes, but if we take past presidents into account, because right now we have the 14 Dalai Lama, basically till now 13 Dalai Lamas have been reincarnated, have
Mhm.
been going through a certain process. So basically, the first process would be of identifying a regent or a regency, because they would be tasked of handling this entire process of reincarnation, which will definitely take a certain amount of time. And many people who study Tibetan history view this period of regency as a period of conflict where power struggles occur. Like recently, I've been watching the House of Dragons, part of Games of Thrones, and I see how the Reds, the Blacks, and the Greens are fighting, for succession. So these sort of things happen. But
Mhm.
the first step is appointing a regency. After the regency, there is the appointment of committees where the Tibetan government, during that time when Tibet was independent,
Mhm.
their delegates would be involved. After this, there would be a forming of selection committee, like teams who would be tasked with these very role of finding and looking out for the next reincarnation. And an interesting aspect here, like one of the major processes involved is what are the signs and symbols by the late Dalai Lama, who passed
Right.
away.
Mhm.
Like, if you take the example of the 13th Dalai Lama, because this is the freshest that we have of
Mhm.
right now,
Mhm.
he was looking eastward, like according to many records. And this sort of indicated to everybody that the next Dalai Lama would be found in the eastern part of Tibet.
Okay.
And on top of this, there is another precedent that has been happening since the second Dalai Lama, that is looking forth in the prestigious and auspicious lake of Hamulatsu, situated in Tibet. Many of the Tibetan lamas go there, do their meditation to get signs. And during this time, during the 13th Dalai Lama, we had the regent of Riting Rinpoche.
Mhm.
So he went to the very lake and he saw signs of particular monastery, a particular village.
Mhm.
So and on top of this, we already had the indication of the next Dalai Lama being east based on these signs. And on top of this, we also have the advice and the visions, the messages by the state oracle, which
Mhm.
is the Nechung oracle and is present currently at Dharamsala. So
Mhm.
he also advised during that time that it's eastward. So all these indications formed a particular direction where the next Dalai Lama would be born. So the next step would be of sending these search committees, these teams to find where the Dalai Lama is. And at many a times, what happens is there are a lot of candidates
Mhm.
that comes across, like, because one cannot confirm saying that this is the Dalai Lama. There are many candidates, and there is a test given to all these candidates of items from the previous Dalai Lama to verify whether this current young boy
Hmm.
has certain ideas of his previous life, and is he really the current this reincarnation of the 13th Dalai Lama. And that happened to a very young boy in Amdo.
Hmm.
Like after 60, 70 years, he is right now the current 14th Dalai Lama. So
Hmm.
he was brought all the way from Amdo to Lhasa during that time. And after the selection, we have the enthronement process,
Hmm.
which happens in Lhasa, and post which we have the final appointment of tutors to the very Dalai Lama.
Hmm.
So, but right now, our big complex is we are not in Tibet right now.
Exactly
So,
right.
what will happen? That is a big question that comes to my mind when
Hmm.
going through these past precedents when it involves the selection of the Dalai Lamas.
I actually wanted to get to that because you mentioned that these higher lamas actually visited. So I'm so sorry if I'm pronouncing few terms and words wrong. I apologize. But these higher lamas traveled to Lamo Latsu Lake, right, the sacred lake,
Yep,
where they had
yep,
these visions. And I mean, I think it was Palden Lamo, the spirit who guided these lamas near the lake and everything during the entire process, right? And actually, it was another interesting thing that I read after conducting these tests where the kids are actually asked to identify the relics of previous Dalai Lama. I think I read somewhere that the former Dalai Lama servants who knew him well were also asked to confirm the child's identity if they showed similar traits or something. Am I wrong, or does it make sense? I mean, is it true?
yep. You're right. You're right in the sense that some of the former attendees of the 13th Dalai
Right.
Lama was also part of the search committee.
Hmm.
So when they were handing not relics for that matter, I think it would be like possessions of the previous Dalai Lama, be it a rosary, a
Hmm.
cane,
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
all these things. So they also found it very auspicious that a young boy, which is the current Dalai Lama, he showed a lot of signs.
Hmm.
And all of these could be also read in the popular book by the current Dalai Lama himself,
Hmm.
a book which all Tibetans are pushed to read. Like the title of the book is My Land and My People. And ironically, it was published in 1962. You know what happened in 1962?
Right.
The Sino-India War. And
Right.
it's the first copy is incidentally available in the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. Like I just visited it a few
Oh,
weeks back with my friend, and we saw it. So it's very interesting.
great. I mean, it really is interesting to see. I mean, a lot of process which happened with the places like Lamulatsu Lake, which are in Tibet. So, do you think because we are not in Tibet, I mean, the Tibetans are not in their home right now. Do you think it will affect the entire process of reincarnation somehow? The maybe the authenticity or the credibility of the entire reincarnation process.
No, I don't think so in that way. Because at the end of the day, like all these processes are made to are kept in place to make the process smooth. But at the end of the day, the say and the decision solely rests upon His Holiness, his
Mm,
own private office, his own institution, which is called the Gandhipura, and the Tibetan people.
mm.
Think whatever he says, like that would be the final thing, right?
Right. I mean, there have been so many statements where Dalai Lama says that maybe he'll not reincarnate, or maybe he'll reincarnate as an insect, or I exactly don't know what he means by that. But if the Dalai Lama, so he's 89 right now, and I think he mentioned that when he turns 90, he will call up a council and he'll discuss about the reincarnation process. But if he for some reason does not want to choose his own successor, and maybe China installs its own candidate, right? Its own puppet. How likely is it that Tibetans in India at least will accept and follow the Chinese appointed Dalai Lama?
Yeah, basically there have been a lot of statements, and it's
Mhm.
statements that are not new. Like I think the first major statement by His Holiness on his own succession was in 1969, if I'm not wrong. He
Mhm.
said whether the institution of Dalai Lama remains or it continues, it solely depends upon the Tibetan people. So one can take a precedent from that note. And
Mhm.
following which, there have been a lot of statements, like you mentioned. And the, I mean, Rakshith, you brought an interesting thing of His Holiness saying next life he might become an insect. So basically, if you follow the law of karma and rebirth, like you can
Mhm.
be born to anybody. So
Right.
that is a possibility. And an interesting possibility which there might not be a 15th Dalai Lama, which His Holiness himself has come to the table saying that. And recently I was watching this interview, this not an interview, this episode at Taiwan Plus, and an American really raised this theme of how what would happen if there was not a Dalai Lama. Very
Mhm.
interesting. But regardless of all this, like
Mhm.
the likelihood that China is going to appoint a Dalai Lama, I think that is more or less given based
Right.
on its appointment of different lamas, including the Pension Lama, which
Hmm.
is considered one of the highest Tibetan lamas in the Gelugpa tradition. So I think one must not confuse, like, uh, one must understand that there are different sects among Tibetan Buddhism.
Hmm.
Each sect has its top lamas, and there are like a different sort of hierarchy. So in the Gelugpa tradition, it is His Holiness the Dalai Lama who is leading it, and following which we have His Holiness the Pension Lama. And the situation of the Pension Lama, everybody knows. Like,
Hmm.
China has appointed its own Pension Lama, which directly conflicts and goes against the appointment, not the appointment, I should say. His Holiness just recognized a young boy, which was at the end of the day searched by the Chinese themselves. But ironically, they opted out of that and selected their own successor, which has a lot of things to do. And at the end of the day, like, his name is Gelsen Opu. Like, if we
Also, no.
see his
Yeah.
current predicament right now, he's given these high positions
Hmm.
in the Chinese Communist Party
Right.
offices, but Tibetans do not revere him. Like, Tibetans, even though Tibetans are forced to, go to see him with where they are paid money, even with such a condition, they don't go and meet him. So we can
Oh.
see what happens, if Chinese select their own lamas, a pension lama. If these things are happening to a pension lama, what would happen to the Dalai Lama? Much bigger level of
Hmm.
such discrepancy would occur,
So
But one thing is certain, Tibetans throughout the world would not accept it. I think that much is very clear.
So I actually thought Panchen Lama is second in command in spiritual authority than
Yeah,
Dalai
in the
Lama.
Gelugpa sect, not
Yeah,
the whole
I,
Tibetan
I
Buddhism.
I wasn't clear about this, but thank you so
Yeah.
much for clarifying. So my next question is about the U.S. Resolve Tibet Act. I mean, they
Mhm.
recently passed the act, but do you think post November elections in the U.S. Is there going to be any changes or loss of momentum in the implementation of this act, or is it just theatrics, or do they really mean it with this act?
I think this act, at the end of the day, it pushes certain things to the table. At the end of the day, I mean, official position of USA does not change. It recognizes the current occupation of PRC
Hmm.
in Tibet. That is very much clear. When President Biden signed this bill on 12th July, he mentioned it. But there are certain developments happening here. I mean, this Resolve Tibet Act, which happened in 2024, is a culmination of a lot of different acts that have been happening in USA, which first started way back in 1990s. It all culminated in the 2002 Tibet Policy Act, yeah, TPA. And
Hmm.
after this, we had the 2018 Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act, following which, during the COVID period, we had the 2020 Tibet Policy Support Act, in which it clearly mentions about the reincarnation. Everything about reincarnation is mentioned in that act. And this act of 2024, the Resolve Tibet Act, is a follow up to that. And it adds certain other new elements whereby the US government, for the first time, recognizes Tibet as not only the Tibet Autonomous Region, but a larger portion of Tibet, which includes the Tibetan Autonomous Prefectures,
Hmm.
based on the 2018 or 17, I'm not clear,
Hmm.
PRC's own document. So this is a very significant. And going on to your question of whether this would change post November election, it will not change because this is a law sign, and if one wants to change it, it'll take a long time. This very act, the Resolve Tibet Act, it took almost 2 years to get it passed.
Hmm.
So if one wants to change it, it'll take such a long time. And on top of this, whoever comes to power, be it a Democrat or a Republican, I think the beautiful thing about US support to Tibet is it is bipartisan. You
Hmm.
find the 2020 Tibet Policy Support Act, it was signed by President Trump, who is one of the candidates for the upcoming presidential election. And the current Resolve Tibet Act is signed by President Joe Biden, a Democrat. So he endorsed Kamala Harris, his own vice president. So I think for the foreseeable future, there would be no change in the act in this manner, that whether it would get dissolved or whatever.
Hmm. Hmm. So I want to talk about the 2007, where China's State Administration of Religious Affairs basically introduced the management measures for the reincarnation of living Buddhas in Tibetan Buddhism. It's also known as Order Number Five, right? Uh, I mean, could you actually elaborate on the key provisions of this order and its impact on the Tibetan Buddhism's reincarnation process? I actually want to understand how do the Chinese look at the entire process, and what are their arguments? Why do they have claim in this entire process? I mean, order number 5, and then I think recently in July also they passed an order number July 2023 they passed an order number 19, which talks
Yes.
about the regulation which requires temples, monasteries, mosques, etc., to obtain official permission to carry out any religious activity. I mean, one hypothesis of mine is that since they have abducted our Panchen Lama and
Mhm.
installed their own Gyaltsen Nobu, uh, maybe they can claim that the next Dalai Lama will be identified by the Panchen Lama himself. Do you think that's a very solid case?
I think that case, I mean, there is some sort of precedent there, but it's not very solid in
Mm-hmm.
my thought, because the Panchen Lama and Dalai Lama, I told you, they are from the Gelugpa sect of Buddhism, so they share a unique relationship. I
Mm-hmm.
believe the first Dalai Lama was the tutor of the first Panchen Lama. There is a dynamic there, and they both of them, like, there was a period in Tibet where both would tutor each other. But
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to recognition, it's not very clear what sort of role it has. Like, maybe at the end of the day, they just recognizes it, in the sense that the Pension Lama does not have the authority to appoint it, but it has the sort of say, like how His Holiness did for the Pension Lama, the young kid in 1995. He, the search committee founded a child who they told His Holiness that this is the Pension Lama. So His Holiness just said, "Okay, you've selected it. I also recognize it." I think that level of interaction might be, but with the current Pension Lama, since nobody, His Holiness himself did not appoint him, and the Tibetan people themselves don't revere it. I don't think how he can, officially recognize the
Mm-hmm.
next Dalai Lama, unless it's by Chinese forces, whatever, as a puppet figure. But regarding order number 5, like, I think the context of Chinese influence of Tibetan tradition of Buddhism, which is at current level turning into Sinicization of Buddhism, is very interesting. Like, it's not something that has happened just now. It traces its root back to history. Like, because in 1953 we had the Buddhist Association of China, which was founded. So this organization has been playing a very vital role since that period. Like, initially when China came into Tibet, like from 19, I mean China in the sense the People's Republic of China, I'm talking, like, we can even go back to history, but let's just keep it at that, like the People's Republic of China. So when they initially came to Tibet, they knew the relevance and the power that Tibetan lamas, especially these reincarnated lamas, these Rinpoches, had, because they were serving the people so good that the people would revere them. So their control over the people was something which the Chinese people wanted. So what they did was they tried to control these very lamas, through different organizations, through different bodies, like, and I mentioned it all culminated in the 1953 establishment of the Buddhist Association of China. But a funny thing happened, like, which everybody knows, like the Cultural Revolution, like, spanned for almost a decade, more than a decade. During that time, whatever they built, it was destroyed. So at the end, you could see from all these nuances that the Chinese Communist Party and their reverence to religious, be it Buddhism, be it their own Confucianism, whatever it is, it's not pure. It's just for political maneuvering and strategic tactics. So eventually, after the Cultural Revolution, we find a revitalization of Tibetan Buddhism in Tibet from the 1980s, during which even delegations from the Tibetan government in exile sent different delegates to Tibet. Like, I think 4 or 5 delegates were able to go to Tibet, assess the situation inside occupied Tibet, what is really happening there. So during this period, like, a lot of lamas were again recruited by this very body, Buddhist Association of China. And after this, we had the 90s, we had the Pension Lama fiasco, right? So following all this, I think China, led by the CCP, understands the power of Tibetan Buddhism. And, learning from their mistake, I think they now felt like, from the whole Pension Lama fiasco, that a system is required. So that is what order number 5 is. It forms a system, a mechanism, a database of sort, through which they could control the living Buddhas, so-called living Buddhas. I mean, for us Tibetans, it's Tuku, reincarnated lamas, but they are also calling them living Buddhas, like, just glorifying them to such a degree, just to use them. So that's how order number 5 came up. And what order number 5 basically does is, at the end of the day, like, search committees, whatever will happen, like, you need a official stamp or a sign of approval from the government to recognize yourself as a reincarnated lama. So
Right.
that is where a lot of Tibetans, and especially people who follow religion for any matter. Like, see, we are in India. There are people who follow different form of religion
mm,
who would like a government imposing to them saying that this Lama is recognized by them. I mean, that's like complete bonkers, especially when the very government in Tibet, like who is in power, does not recognize Buddhism. So that's the basic irony that's happening here. And because of all this, like order number 5, it has been applied since 27.
mm,
There has been a lot of developments on this, like Rakshit, you rightly said. Recently, they came out with order number 15, where it takes this step to another level. Which step it's taking? It's taking the Sinicization of Tibetan Buddhism,
mm,
where now Tibetan lamas, Tibetan monasteries, whether they allowed to teach Tibetan Buddhism, now they have to get that approval from the
mm,
so-called Chinese Communist government.
mm,
And if you want to know more here, I think the International Campaign of Tibet, which is based in America, they've come out with an amazing report. Like I've read this and it's
mm,
very interesting. It's the report is titled as Buddhist Association of China takes a leading role in China's attempts to control and forcibly reshape Tibetan Buddhism.
mm.
So this is something which I think all of us should read if one wants to understand what China is doing when it comes to the Tibetan tradition of Buddhism in India. Not in India, I mean in Tibet, because at the end of the day, they've pushed 800, I think I can call it, yeah, 800 sacred religious tradition to a smart card. At the end of the day, now whether you're a Lama or not, you're recognized through that card. So
Wow.
that's what's happening now.
Mm. And just for the benefit of our listeners, I wanted to talk about the PRC's, basically United Front Work Department's document, where I don't remember exactly the name of the document, but in one of them they mention how they look at this process, where they mention that the Reincarnation Convention of Living Buddhas in Tibet was established during the Yuan dynasty, which goes back to 1271, right? And which was developed in the Ming dynasty and improved during the Qing dynasty under the administration of the central government. So I think, which really does not make sense. But yeah, whatever they want to say, but yeah, I wanted to bring this. I mean,
I mean, see,
it's
Rakshit, it's
totally.
funny here. See, some
Hmm,
of the things that they've said here, it
hmm,
is factual in the sense that during the 12th to 13th century, first reincarnation was there. But
hmm,
whether the Ming dynasty during that period had authority of Tibet, that is questionable. So
hmm,
China is very clever in that. These campaign of disinformation that's happening, I think this is one tool where they use it. And
hmm,
especially when you say during when Emperor Xinglong was there, like,
hmm,
his coming to Tibet itself, like it was because some internal issue in Tibet happened, and Tibet during that time had to seek help from him.
hmm,
So that is how this all happened. It's not like they came to Tibet and invaded Tibet.
hmm,
So China is sort of creating such information from some factual truth, which
right.
is confusing everybody. Which for myself also, unless one reads it thoroughly, it is very confusing.
I guess misinformation through selective interpretation or that kind of stuff.
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah. So, I mean, I had this opportunity to go through the literature of three generations of Tibetans,
Mm.
where the first generation's writings were actually more aggressive in nature regarding to China and their home, Tibet. And the second generation, like I've read few works of Tenzin Sundu, where he is aggressive with his writings. I mean, he really is passionate, but the tone is dialed down. And the third generation is much more abstract. I don't
Yeah.
see a lot of literature which is as aggressive in tone as the first generation or the second generation. So my question is, I mean, how has the Tibetan diaspora in India, I mean, diaspora, particularly the younger generation, the third generation
Mm.
I'm talking about, responded to these uncertainties surrounding Dalai Lama's succession and China's increasing assertiveness. I mean, I'm just making an assumption. I
Yeah,
don't,
yeah.
just correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe because they are the third generation are financially more stable now compared to the struggles first generation and second generation have gone through. Do you think there's a fading sense of homeliness or that kind of stuff among the third generation? Do you think they are as passionate as first generation and second generation Tibetans?
I think they are definitely, Rakshit. Some of your points that you say, there is some relevance there. I'm not saying I cannot completely dismiss it.
Hmm,
But see, I've been reading some articles from 1980s by Tibetans, what they are writing and what we are writing. Definitely, I can see some differences, like which you observe.
hmm,
But one thing that I can say, like I myself am a Tibetan youth,
hmm,
and what we Tibetan youth feel, like we have the big question for us is about identity. But at the end of the day, like our idea of Tibet, our yearning to go back home, I think that is very much strong. I remember saying this to a podcast. See, my father, like, I did not know this when I was young. My father placed my own picture at Mount Kailash. So my father's family is from that region in Tibet. So I did not understand what he was doing, like, but eventually, like, when you grow up, you sort of realize these things. So I think the same thing is happening with the Tibetan youths currently, and expounding more on it, like, I can bring you some anecdotes. Like,
mm,
there is this Future of Seeds documentary done by my good friend, like I met him recently at Dharamsala,
mm,
Kusang Tenzin. He runs this channel called Stories of Tibet.
mm,
So this is on the official media of the Central Tibetan Administration, which is also known as the Tibetan Government in Exile, Tibet TV. So I think currently there are three episodes out, if I'm not wrong. All of these interviews are done to very young Tibetans, class 8, class 7. So some of their utterances, when I listen to them, I feel empowered, like what their idea of Tibet is, what they want to do. One guy said at the end of the day, a young guy, I want to join the SFF.
mhm,
So all these things are very relevant and sort of showcases what the notion of Tibet and His Holiness the Dalai Lama, these very future seeds of Tibet has. And mentioning the future of Tibet, like, I was privileged enough to be part as a core team member of the Future of Tibet, which has done conferences in different parts of the world. They held one in Washington, D.C.,
mhm,
they held one in Paris, they held one in New York, and they held one in Delhi and Dharamsala. So I was involved in the Delhi and Dharamsala leg where I work, the Foundation for Nonviolent Alternatives. We did a collaborative program in Delhi. But
mhm,
what was interesting was at the Dharamsala conference, like, all us youths, we had Tibetan youths who were from India, from South India, like different parts of India, from the West, Europe, America. Then we had Tibetans who had recently come from Tibet. So level of interaction happened among us, and we came out with this declaration. And in this declaration there are many points, but there were two major points which directly tied to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So first point was we wanted His Holiness to reincarnate, because Rakshith, as mentioned before, His Holiness came out with this possibility, saying that there might not be another Dalai Lama, there might not be a 15th Dalai Lama. So
mm,
this is one of our requests in the declaration. And the second sort of statement in our declaration was how we as young Tibetans know that the period between the 14th and the 15th Dalai Lama, the succession period,
mm.
that is going to be a period of unrest, maybe chaos to a certain extent.
Right. It generally takes about 2 to 3 years, right, for the entire process. I
Yeah.
mean, until we have a new with the 14th Dalai Lama. I think it took 4 years or something, but on an average, it's 2 or 3 years.
The 13th Dalai Lama passed away in 1933. The 14th, His Holiness, was born in 35,
Mm.
and he was officially enthroned in 1940.
40.
And at 1940, he was a young 5-year-old boy.
Right.
So that is, if you add when he assumes political maturity, that is almost, I think, 2 decades. One can assume 2 decades,
Oh.
which recently even Claude RP was mentioning.
Mhm,
That's why he is very much for the process of emanation. But before all that, like going back to the declaration, so we said that there is this period of unrest. So China is going to use this period to create instability. So
mhm,
we want His Holiness and his officers to set up a nice mechanism, or a nice sort of authoritative region for that matter. So these were our requests, a request by Tibetan youngsters, and this very much shows what they care. And but I don't know, like, how to put it. Like, I was there when we presented this to His Holiness in
mhm,
person. His Holiness, like, just said to us, like, don't worry about reincarnation. Like, it is important, but
mhm,
don't worry about it. What you as Tibetan youngsters must do is to preserve our unique Tibetan culture and identity, especially our Tibetan language, as this is the very thing that connects you meaning us Tibetan youths in exile, and the Tibetans in occupied Tibet. So that was very powerful.
that's it. But I think with that, I mean, we can end the session. Thank you so much, Tenzing Dhamdul, for taking out time and joining this podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here. And thank you so much for sharing all those, I mean, taking those questions in a really positive manner and answering us. Thank you so much.
Sure, Rakshit. Pleasure was all mine. Hopefully, I've been able to do justice with my mere knowledge on these subjects. So,
No,
thank you
you
so
did.
much.
It was really amazing. And to our listeners, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of All Things Policy. See you all in the next episode.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.